The royal engineer? She chirped, her voice a mix of disbelief and indignation as she glared at the man crouched before her. He was clad in standard-issue maintenance coveralls, a stark contrast to the opulent, shimmering chamber. Technically, yeah, Kalen replied, his focus entirely on the delicate shield generator embedded in the intricate collar of her ceremonial gown. He adjusted the grip on his sonic calibrator. Now hold still, your littleness. This emitter is right over your primary artery. A cascade of blue sparks erupted from the device, fizzling against the polished floor. The most formidable Empress in the Cygnus arm gasped. A tiny, sharp sound, and realized with utter astonishment that this human had absolutely no clue who he was dealing with. In the heart of the Zillion flagship Starlight Scepter, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and rare incense. Walls of liquid crystal pulsed with soft light, curving around a central dais where Empress Lyra of the Vesperan Dominion stood, rigid and furious. She barely cleared 3 feet tall, a vision of silver and amethyst, her regal attire compromised by a flickering personal shield that had failed during a state function. The silence was a physical weight, broken only by the hum of Kalen's tools. He hadn't bowed upon entering, hadn't recited the traditional greetings. He just strode in, taken one look at her, and muttered, "Ha!" The briefing holos didn't do the scale justice. Adorable, though. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Her Praetorian guards, hulking figures in polished crimson armor, leveled their pulse lances in unison, the weapons humming to life, their tips glowing with contained energy. Kalen froze, one hand still raised with his probe, and slowly raised an eyebrow. "Whoa, easy there, big guys. I meant the craftsmanship. The filigree on the shield housing is intricate." He squinted at the delicate metalwork around her neck. Didn't realize the Dominion was into such fine detail. The tiny Empress, Lyra, sovereign of the 7 veiled stars, could only stare, her mouth slightly agape. Her skin, the color of twilight with a subtle bioluminescent shimmer, seemed to glow brighter with her rising temper. No one, in her entire reign or before it, had ever used such a tone with her. Most subjects could barely meet her gaze without their voices trembling. And here was the scruffy human from the Auxiliary Engineering Corps, with what looked like engine grease permanently etched under his fingernails, talking to her as if she were a faulty power coupling. "Your insolence borders on treason," hissed her chief attendant, a tall, severe Zillion named Vorian. But Lyra raised a single delicate hand, her large, star-flecked eyes fixed on the human. "No. I wish to observe this interaction." Kalen let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Great, because my scanner says your personal shield is about as stable as a soap bubble in a solar wind." He waved a diagnostic wand, its tip blinking erratically as he crouched to her eye level. Pretty emitter. Janky power flow." Her lips twitched. "You dare critique the premier shield weavers of Vespera?" He didn't look up from his scanner. "Lady, I've seen child's toys with more robust circuitry. Now hold still." The collective gasp from her courtiers was like a sudden breeze. He tapped the edge of her collar, found the primary access rune, and pulled out a tool that looked like a cross between a sculptor's pick and a cryptographic key. The proximity was unnerving. The shield emitter was molded flush against her throat, a piece of jewelry as much as a defensive tool. For the first time in recent memory, Lyra felt acutely self-conscious. "You could at least have the decency to show some reverence. Can't see sparkles," he said, utterly casual as he worked the emitter's seal. "You'll live." Her voice went sharp. "Sparkles. I am the Empress of the Vesperan Dominion." He grinned faintly, not pausing in his work. "Yeah, and I'm the king of patch jobs. You've got a fractured conduit right here, see?" The chamber attendants were visibly scandalized. Lyra wanted to be furious. She should have been furious. But she found herself suppressing an unfamiliar, fluttering sensation in her chest. The human wasn't mocking her the way rival ambassadors did, with thinly veiled contempt. He was teasing her, like an equal. There was no fear in him, no obsequious trembling, just a bedrock of calm competence. When he adjusted a microscopic component near the main crystal, a rogue spark jumped, making her yelp and instinctively clutch his wrist. He looked up, startled, meeting her wide, startled eyes. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Lyra froze. Her hand was minuscule against his, her slender, twilight-hued fingers curled around the rough, callous skin of a man who worked with energy fields and superheated metal every day. She released him as if burned, straightening her posture to its full, albeit limited, height. "You will not speak of that sound I made," she said, flustered. "Which one? The squeak or the hey? Watch it?" She made to swat him with the data slate she was holding, but he laughed quietly. All right. The Empress has a mean left hook." The emitter finally clicked, its soft, steady hum returning. He leaned back on his heels, admiring his work. "There, fixed. Try activating it. See if it still flickers." She tapped a hidden control on her wrist, and a shimmering, stable field of light enveloped her for a moment before she deactivated it. Relief washed through her small frame. "It is stable." "Good," he said, dusting off his hands on his coveralls. "Wouldn't want my most prestigious client to get zapped by her own jewelry that earned a glare so intense it could have vaporized hull plating." "Most prestigious client? You do realize you address a ruler of 7 systems." He smiled, meeting her gaze evenly. "Yeah, still smaller than my hydrospanner." More gasps rippled through the court, but Lyra only stood there, caught between utter outrage and a bizarre, bubbling amusement. The guards looked to her for a command, any command, to drag this insufferable human away, but she waved them off, a curious, almost imperceptible smirk ghosting across her lips. "You are either phenomenally brave or clinically insane," she stated. "Little of both," Kalen replied, rising to his full height, which from her perspective seemed to scrape the ceiling. "Mostly just behind on my paperwork." He packed his tools, gave her a 2-fingered salute that was in no way regulation, and started toward the exit. "If it shorts out again, Sparkles, just ping me." Her jaw dropped. "Sparkles, you dare." But he was already gone, the doors swishing shut behind him, the sound of him whistling some off-key human tune fading down the corridor. When the silence returned, thicker than before, the Empress realized her heart was hammering against her ribs. The echo of his laughter, so irreverent and warm, seemed to linger in the chamber like a new kind of energy. Lyra had never summoned the same individual twice. Not her most decorated generals, not her most brilliant scientists, not even her most trusted personal attendants. But that night, as her court buzzed with scandalized whispers about the human's breathtaking audacity, she sat alone in her private sanctum, the scene replaying in her mind on a loop. He'd called her Sparkles. No one had used such a frivolous, personal tone with her since she was a child playing in the palace gardens. "Unacceptable," she muttered to herself, pacing across the iridescent, fluid-like floor of her chamber. "Utterly insubordinate." And yet, her thoughts betrayed her. His grin, that ridiculous calm in the face of certain death, the way he spoke as if her crown, her title, her very empire were minor details. For a sovereign who commanded billions, she found herself strangely fixated on one scruffy engineer who treated her not just as an equal, but as a mischievous one at that. The next morning, she delivered an order that sent her high council into a silent, wide-eyed panic. Assign the human engineer, Kalen Vorik, to the Royal Technical Support roster. Indefinitely, her ministers exchanged wary, confused glances. "Your Radiance," one dared to speak. "Surely you do not intend to." "I do." Lyra cut him off, her voice leaving no room for argument. "His methods are unorthodox, but his results are unimpeachable." Kalen nearly choked on his synthetic coffee substitute when the official summons chimed on his datapad. "The Empress wants me?" Again, the messenger, a young Zillion adept, nodded nervously. "Her Magnificence requests your presence." "Personally," Kalen groaned, running a hand through his already messy hair. "Great, maybe her tiara's throwing off her center of gravity this time." When he re-entered her private chamber, the scene was much the same. The glimmering walls, the palpable tension, and the same 3-foot-tall monarch staring up at him like a contained supernova in elegant slippers. "Vorik?" she said sharply, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, a picture of regal impatience. "My holographic interface is malfunctioning. The star maps keep stuttering." He crouched beside the ornate projector console, running a handheld scanner over its surface. "Didn't know star charts got stage fright. You sure you didn't enable the artistic interpretation mode by accident?" Her mouth fell open in sheer disbelief. "I do not enable artistic interpretation when reviewing fleet deployments."
Relax, Sparkles. I'm kidding.
He smirked. "Mostly." Her cheeks flared a darker shade of violet. "You will cease addressing me by that moniker." "Sorry," he said, clearly not sorry at all. "It's a human thing. We use it for people who shine under pressure." "Then use another," she snapped, uncrossing and recrossing her arms. "Something less diminutive." "All right," he said, tapping the console. "How about your tiniest?" She nearly exploded. "You insufferable." "Joking again," he said quickly, a laugh in his voice. "Mostly." He leaned closer to the console, his shoulder accidentally brushing against her arm. She stiffened, a jolt of something entirely unfamiliar shooting through her, but she didn't pull away. The low hum of his scanner filled the sudden silence. "Ha!" he murmured. "Your emitter matrix is distinct from the core projector. Probably a feedback loop from the ship's main comms array." "I see." "No, you don't," he winked. "That's why you called me." Her jaw clenched, but her eyes, those vast, star-flecked pools, softened just a fraction. "You are impossible." "Thanks." Calibration dialed deep within the console. A new shower of sparks, these ones of benign gold, flickered beneath his fingers. Lyra flinched again, her hand darting out to clutch his forearm in a reflexive, surprisingly strong grip. It was the same motion as before. He looked down at her small hand on his sleeve and smiled, a gentle, knowing look in his eyes. "You sure you don't just like having an excuse to hold my arm during these repairs?" "I what?" She dropped his arm as if it were white-hot. "Absolutely not." Right, he said, turning back to his work. "Just a royal tradition, huh?" The steadying the help ceremony. The holographic star field snapped into perfect, crystal-clear focus, the planets and nebulae hanging in the air, steady and brilliant. He stood, dusting his hands on his pants. "There, good as new. Try not to zoom into any supernovas too quickly." Lyra eyed the projection suspiciously. "You fixed it that quickly? Fast service is part of the charm, your radiance." He'd almost slipped again. She caught it immediately. "You almost said it again. Old habits. Then you must unlearn them," she said. But her voice lacked its usual imperial conviction, and Kalen noticed. He gave her a grin that seemed to warm the entire chamber. "We'll see." When he left, Lyra sat in the newly restored glow of her star map, the silence of the room feeling vast and empty without his infuriating presence. Her attendants dared not speak, but they could feel the shift in her, the distraction that clung to her like a new perfume. Later, she found herself issuing another order, this one even more transparent. "Schedule Vorik for a diagnostic of the ambient biolighting in my reading salon." "Yes, tomorrow." "But, Your Majesty," her chief attendant Vorian interjected. "The biolights were calibrated just last week. They are operating at peak efficiency." "I am aware," Lyra said, not meeting his gaze. "They have developed a chill, a most unpleasant coolness. It is practically tragic." The attendants exchanged a series of glances that spoke volumes as she turned away, desperately trying to hide the faint, traitorous curve of a smile tugging at her lips. The next day, Kalen returned, his toolkit slung over his shoulder and a familiar, infuriating smirk already in place. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing with an exaggerated flourish that was anything but respectful. I hear your lights have come down with a case of the cosmic shivers. Lyra rolled her eyes, a gesture she seemed to be practicing solely for his benefit. Just fix them. Yes, ma'am. I live to serve the shiniest empires first. A scandalized gasp from Vorian. But Lyra laughed. A short, startled, utterly genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. Kalen blinked, then his grin widened. There it is. Knew you had a sense of humor buried under all that cosmic authority. She composed herself instantly, pretending to be fascinated by the texture of her throne's armrest. You are fortunate. I find a certain amusement in your foolishness. Oh, I'm counting my blessings, he said, flicking a panel open. A few harmless, silvery sparks flared. Might need to say a little prayer for your wiring next. Her heart gave a funny, skipping beat. You truly are unlike any being I have ever encountered. Yeah, I get that a lot, he said lightly. Mostly from ex-girlfriends and disgruntled supervisors. When he finished, the biolights glowed with a warmer, richer hue. She tilted her head, regarding him. You are dismissed, Engineer Vorik. He nodded but paused at the door. Try not to miss me too much before tomorrow's. What are we faking next? A wobbly leg on your favorite settee. Lyra sputtered. I do not fake emergencies. The door swished closed on his retreating laughter. She stared after him, her cheeks glowing a bright, luminous violet, then whispered, so quietly only she could hear. He is insufferable. A pause. And I like him. By the time the third urgent malfunction was announced, even the stoic Praetorian guards had stopped pretending it was a coincidence. Kalen arrived at the Empress's private solarium to find a handful of attendants meticulously dusting already spotless surfaces. When he entered, all subtle eyes shifted to Lyra, who was seated upon a floating divan, trying to project an air of dignified preoccupation as she inspected a perfectly polished, utterly flawless data crystal. He frowned, setting his kit down with a soft thud. So, what's the crisis du jour? Her voice was a masterclass in regal nonchalance. My personal comlink has developed a lag in its audio transmission. He walked over, crouched down beside her, and tapped the device's interface. You mean this little earpiece right here? Yes, she said, a bit too quickly. He ran a quick diagnostic. The screen flashed a steady, confident blue, indicating optimal performance. Zero lag. Latency is better than spec, actually. Lyra blinked. Perhaps. The lag has resolved itself. Kalen raised an eyebrow. Amazing. Self-healing comms. The techs back on Mars would pay a fortune for that. Her lips pursed into a thin line. You mock your Empress yet again. He smiled, a soft, knowing thing. No. I'm just admiring your dedication to preventative maintenance. Sparkles. The attendants gasped in unison. Lyra's eyes widened. But instead of the expected eruption of royal wrath, she let out a huff, her cheeks puffing out just slightly. You are incorrigible, Vorik. Guilty, he said, slipping the tool back into his pocket. So, you just wanted me to hang out, huh? Her back straightened as if she'd been shocked. I would never abuse my authority for such a trivial purpose. Sure, he said easily, standing up. Then I'll get out of your hair. Or whatever that lovely shimmering stuff is. He turned to leave, and for a single heart-stopping moment, a wave of pure panic washed over her. Wait, he stopped, glancing over his shoulder. Yeah, Lyra fumbled, her mind racing for any plausible excuse. You should check the divan stabilizers as well. They have been emitting a dissonant hum. He listened for a moment, his head cocked. You mean the faint, resonant hum that's part of its standard anti-grav field? Yes, that hum, she insisted. I find it distracting. He chuckled softly, a warm, rich sound, and stepped closer. You find your floating couch humming distracting. That's like hating the sound of your own heartbeat. I am not accustomed to such auditory interference during my meditations, she said, her nose in the air. Right? He said, pulling a multi-wrench from his belt. Guess I'll install a mute button for your royal contemplation time. Lyra crossed her arms, trying and failing to hide the smile that threatened to break her composed facade. You may proceed. He slid under the levitating divan, half lying on the floor, muttering to himself about impossible requests from people who've never had to rewire a plasma conduit in deep space. Lyra leaned forward slightly, watching the concentrated focus on his face, the deft movements of his hands. There was none of the usual reverence, only an easy, confident care. When he emerged, a fresh smudge of coolant grease streaked across his temple. She hesitated, then reached into a fold of her gown, producing a small, impossibly soft silk cloth. You have a residue. He blinked, reached up and carefully wiped the grease from his skin. For a moment, her hand lingered, her fingers just barely brushing his cheek. Thanks, he said, his voice quieter than before. Lyra cleared her throat, pulling her hand back as if from a flame. I cannot have my chief engineer appearing as though he maintains the garbage compactors. Of course not, he said, the grin returning. Bad for the Imperial brand. Her lips twitched. You enjoy teasing me far too much. It's a coping mechanism, he said. You're terrifying. That earned a soft, real laugh from her. Perhaps I could be less terrifying if you were less impossible. I think that's the balance, he said with a shrug. Later that evening, as the palace settled into its nocturnal quiet, Lyra stood before her reflection, trying to decipher the persistent, fluttering sensation beneath her ribs. She had been called many things in her life: formidable, brilliant, ruthless, but never Sparkles. And somehow, when he said it, it didn't feel like an insult. Felt fond. She frowned at her shimmering visage. The fourth summons came with a note of genuine, if manufactured, urgency. Kalen didn't even feign surprise. He was already en route to the royal quarters when the official ping arrived on his wristcom. The guards at her door simply nodded him through, their expressions a mixture of resignation and what might have been amusement. He'd become a familiar anomaly in the polished, silent hallways. A tall, oil-stained human walking with a casual confidence that belonged nowhere near the inner sanctum of the Vesperan Empress. Inside, Lyra was standing before her full-length mirror of liquid mercury, fidgeting with the central clasp of her formal ambassadorial regalia. Vorik, she greeted without turning, her voice attempting regal detachment but landing somewhere softer. You are late. I got here before your dress committed treason, didn't I? He said, setting his toolkit down with a purposeful clatter. That's early by my standards. Her reflection's mouth twitched in a barely suppressed smile. You seem to take pride in your punctual mediocrity. Only when it impresses royalty. That did it. She turned, hiding her grin behind a practiced scoff. This inertial stabilizer in the gown's hem has malfunctioned. I am to greet the tri-system delegation in less than an hour. He stepped closer, kneeling to examine the intricate weave of smart fibers and microgyros. You know, you really should stop hiring the same designers. It's all aesthetics and no applied physics. This was woven by the master artisans of SETI Prime, she protested, her mouth falling open in mock offense. He shrugged, running a scanner over the fabric. And they apparently failed basic gravity theory. This thing is a death trap waiting for a wrong step. She wanted to scold him, to defend the honor of SETI Prime, but the words caught in her throat. He was close again, too close, and she could see the faint reflection of her own flustered expression in his focused eyes. When his fingers brushed against the hidden control node on her hip, her breath hitched audibly. The contact was purely professional, she told herself firmly. Yet her racing pulse didn't seem to agree. Kalen noticed, glancing up. Am I hurting you? No, she said a little too quickly. You are simply excessively familiar. Familiar. He smirked. That's what happens when you call me in 4 times a week. We start skipping the small talk. Her gaze darted away, the glow in her cheeks intensifying. You are fortunate I find your insolence tolerable. Tolerable is one word for it, he said, his attention returning to the stabilizer. I'd say invited. That made her blink. Invited. Sure. Every time you invent another flickering light or a wobbly piece of furniture, it feels less like a work order and more like an invitation. Not to fix things, just to be here. Her throat tightened. Do not presume to know my motives. Then stop summoning me, he said gently, not as an accusation, but a simple statement. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the faint whir of his sonic driver as he reset the stabilizer's calibration. She finally whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. If I did not summon you, you would not come. He paused, then smiled, a soft, private thing. You might be surprised what I do without a royal decree, your radiance. Her eyes widened slightly, but before she could form a response, the chamber doors hissed open and Vorian entered, announcing the imminent arrival of the delegates. She flinched, the Empress mask snapping back into place instantly. Kalen stepped back, tools in hand, and gave a small, genuine nod. Try not to trip over any diplomats during your speech. Slowly, a long, controlled breath. You are dismissed, Engineer Vorik. He hesitated at the door, just long enough to flash that infuriating, wonderful grin. As you wish, Sparkles. Her glare could have melted tritanium, but the corners of her mouth trembled, fighting a losing battle against a smile. The diplomatic reception dragged on for what felt like an eternity. The delegates from the Tri-System Alliance postured and preened, their words a carefully crafted dance of politics and veiled threats. But Lyra's mind was elsewhere. Every time she moved, the gown's hem floated perfectly, the stabilizer humming smoothly where his hands had been. She barely registered the trade agreements she ratified or the territorial disputes she mediated. When the last delegate finally bowed and retreated, and she was alone in the suddenly vast and quiet reception hall, she sank onto a floating bench and let out a sigh that came from the very core of her being. He is intolerable, she muttered to the empty air. Utterly, completely intolerable. Vorian entered quietly, his steps silent on the polished floor. Your Majesty, the human has been rotated to the long-range sensor maintenance team for the next cycle. Shall I make the reassignment permanent? Her voice sharpened, laced with a sudden, unexpected urgency. Cancel it. The aide blinked, confused. But, Majesty, the rotation is standard procedure. Cancel it? She repeated, her tone brooking no argument. He remains on the royal roster. I want him stationed near my quarters. Yes, your radiance. When Vorian had gone, Lyra leaned back against the cool, floating surface of the bench, pressing her palm flat against the subtle thrum of the stabilizer over her heart. It was warm, not from the machinery, but from something far more complex and terrifying. The next day, she didn't summon him. It was a test, a trial of willpower. She wanted to see if he would come of his own volition. She spent the morning pretending to review stellar cartography reports, her attention perpetually divided, her ears straining for the sound of the door chime. By mid-afternoon, as she sat tracing the same star cluster for the 10th time, the door finally hissed open. Kalen poked his head in, his expression a mixture of curiosity and that ever-present amusement. Hey, heard you didn't break anything today. You feeling okay? Her lips curved upward despite her best efforts. I am perfectly functional, thank you. And no repairs are required. Good, he said, stepping fully into the room and letting the door swish shut behind him. Then I'm here on a social call. Her eyebrows shot up towards her hairline. A what? He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. I figured if you're gonna keep inventing malfunctions, we might as well drop the pretense and just talk. Her pulse did a funny little skip-hop. You are remarkably bold for a man who is, at this very moment, surrounded by armed guards who report directly to me. They like me, he said with a dismissive wave. I fixed the replicator in their mess hall. They get real chocolate pudding now. She laughed then, an unguarded, melodic sound that seemed to surprise the very air in the chamber. You are impossible, Vorik. Maybe, he said, pushing off the doorframe and taking a few steps closer, his voice dropping into a softer register. But admit it, you'd be bored out of your mind if I stopped showing up. Her eyes locked with his, the challenge and the truth hanging between them. That is an impertinent question. Not a denial, though. She stared at him for a long, silent moment, the air irrevocably regrettable. He gave her a mock salute, his own smile warm and knowing as he turned to leave. As the door sealed shut, Lyra whispered into the silence, the words meant for no one but herself. Too late. It happened 2 days later during the Grand Ascendancy Gala. The main audience chamber was a spectacle of light and sound, filled with the most powerful and influential beings from across the 7 systems. The Empress stood at the center of it all, a radiant figure in her now perfectly functioning gown, the very image of Vesperan power and grace. Kalen, stationed as part of the technical support team, lingered near a service entrance, trying to be inconspicuous. He watched her command the room, her voice clear and resonant as she spoke of unity and strength, and he felt a strange, proprietary pride swell in his chest. She's amazing, he muttered under his breath. Then his trained eyes caught something. A flicker. Not in the lights or the holograms, but in the energy readings on his wrist scanner, which was still passively scanning the room's systems. He'd keyed it to the Empress's unique biosignature and shield frequency after the last repair. The readout was spiking erratically. Not a system's failure. An energy buildup. Proximity charge. Oh, hell no, he breathed, his blood running cold. He was moving before he even consciously formed the thought, shoving past a confused Zillion dignitary. Bomb! He barked at the nearest Praetorian guard, who stared at him in blank incomprehension. Under the dais. Get her clear. The guards hesitated for a fatal half-second, their training conflicting with the shocking source of the warning. Lyra saw him coming, her speech faltering. Vorik? What are you? He hit the edge of the platform at a full sprint, not breaking stride. The world seemed to slow down. He saw the floor panels beneath her throne beginning to glow a malevolent red. He didn't tackle her. That would have been too crude, too likely to injure her small frame. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, using his own momentum to spin them both off the dais and behind the relative cover of the massive, ornate structure just as the charge detonated. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was concussive and bright, designed for assassination, not destruction. The shockwave hurled them to the polished floor, a rain of shattered crystal and molten metal shrapnel peppering the air where she had been standing moments before. When the ringing in his ears subsided, Kalen groaned, blinking spots from his vision. His back screamed in protest where a piece of debris had gouged him. Your Majesty! Guards shouted, swarming the area, but Lyra wasn't looking at them. She was kneeling beside him, her small, strong hands pressing against his shoulders as if to keep him from fading away. You idiot! She breathed, her voice trembling with a terror she had never known. Why would you do that? He winced, trying for a grin and managing only a pained grimace. Your dress stabilizer would have been a mess. Her composure, that legendary Vesperan control, fractured. That is not funny. Didn't say it was. He coughed, looking up at her through the settling dust. You okay? She nodded stiffly, her star-flecked eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I am unharmed. Thanks to you. Good, he said softly. Would have ruined my perfect repair record if you'd gotten scuffed. She glared at him, her fear transmuting into a fierce, protective anger. Do not joke about your injuries. He tried to sit up, but she pushed him back down with surprising force. Lie still. Your radiance, I'm fine. That was an order, Kalen Vorik. The use of his full name silenced him instantly. Medics rushed in, their scanners humming over his body, applying a coagulant gel to the wound on his back. The room was a cacophony of shouts and alarms, but Lyra refused to be moved from his side. When they finally lifted him onto an anti-grav stretcher, she grabbed his hand, her tiny, warm fingers curling tightly around his. Do not dare die, she whispered, her voice raw. Not before I have you court-martialed for such stupidity. He managed a faint, genuine smile. That's the most romantic threat I've ever heard. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She just looked at him, and in that moment, every title, every protocol, every light year of distance between them vanished, leaving nothing but the stark, terrifying truth of what they both felt. Kalen wasn't supposed to be conscious, much less arguing, barely 12 hours after the explosion. But regulations had never been his strong suit. He'd already sweet-talked a medbot into disabling the bed's restraint field, and when Empress Lyra returned from the Emergency Security Council, she found him sitting on the edge of the medbay cot, trying to pull his stained jacket over the fresh regeneration patch on his back. "You impossible fool!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the sterile white room, startling the two medical attendants who quickly found urgent business elsewhere. "You could reopen the wound." He winced, pausing mid-motion. "You sound just like my old foreman on the Jovian freighters." "I should have you reassigned to a Jovian freighter," she fumed, storming closer until she was standing directly in front of him, her head barely reaching his waist even as he sat. "Or have you physically welded to this bed until you learn the most basic concept of self-preservation?" He gave her a lopsided, pained grin. "You'd get lonely after a day." "I would not." "You would," he said, his voice calm and utterly certain. Her anger faltered, crumbling under the weight of his perception. She hated that he could see straight through her royal fury to the sheer, gut-wrenching terror that lay beneath. "You are the most insufferable being in the 7 systems." "Yeah," he said, smiling faintly as he finally managed to get one arm into a sleeve. "But you like me anyway." Her mouth opened, then closed with a soft click. She turned away from him, the long, shimmering filaments of her hair swishing in agitation. "You presume far too much for a common mechanic." "Maybe," he said, leaning back slightly on his hands, his expression turning thoughtful. "But I've had a lot of time to think while lying here. About all those malfunctions. The lights, the interface, the gown. None of them were ever really broken, were they?" She stiffened, her back to him. "You repaired what I commanded you to repair." He chuckled softly, a warm sound in the cold room. "Sure. But I'm starting to think the only thing you really wanted fixed was the silence." Her shoulders tightened, the fabric of her simple day dress straining. "You overstep, Vorik." He pushed himself off the bed, ignoring the twinge of pain, and stepped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Maybe. But I'm not wrong, am I?" Lyra's jaw clenched, the fine bones standing out, her composure a thin veneer over a roiling sea of emotion. "You are an impossible man." He smiled, a gentle, knowing thing. "Yeah, but I think you like that too." "Stop saying that," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Why?" "Because it's true," she whispered, the confession torn from her before she could stop it. The words hung in the antiseptic air, stark and undeniable. Both of them froze. Kalen's expression softened, his voice dropping to a low, reverent murmur. "Say that again." "I will not." "Come on, Lyra." He used her name. "Not your radiance. Not sparkles. Just Lyra. Quiet, unguarded, intimate. You can command an empire, but you can't admit what you feel?" Her cheeks burned with a luminous, violet heat. "You dare address me so?" He reached out then, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently brushed his thumb against the line of her jaw, silencing the burgeoning royal decree before it could form. "You don't have to keep pretending, not with me. You never did." For a moment, she didn't breathe. The hum of the medical monitors faded into a distant buzz, her world narrowing to the point where his skin met hers. It wasn't the touch of a subject. It wasn't even the touch of a lover. It was the touch of an equal. "You presume far too much, human." "Maybe," he said, his voice steady, his gaze holding hers. "But I'd rather presume and be wrong than stay quiet and never know." She wanted to be furious. She needed to be furious. She was the Empress of the Vesperan Dominion, the descendant of the Starweavers, the woman whose word could redirect asteroid belts and silence rebellions. But the only thing she could think about was the warmth of his hand and how it didn't feel like disrespect. Felt like coming home. He sighed, the sound full of a strange, hopeful sadness, and let his hand drop, stepping back. You don't have to say anything. I needed you to know. I needed to be honest. Lyra's throat tightened painfully. Honesty? She repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. No one has ever dared be honest with me. They bow, they flatter, they hide behind layers of protocol. But you, I just fix things, he said with a faint, weary smile. Even when they aren't broken. She turned away quickly, her emotions waging a silent war against a lifetime of training. You are dismissed. Rest. That is an imperial command. Sure, he said, the smile lingering in his voice. But I'll be around, Lyra. You can order me away all you want, but I'll keep showing up. Because I think you need someone who doesn't bow. She spun to face him, her eyes blazing with a light that could guide starships. And what makes you so certain you are that person? He stepped close again, lowering his head just enough for their eyes to meet on level ground, his presence both a challenge and a comfort. Because every time I look at you, he said, his voice soft but unwavering, I don't see an empress. I see someone who laughs at terrible jokes, hides behind a crown, and pretends her heart is made of neutronium. She blinked rapidly, a single traitorous tear escaping to trace a shimmering path down her twilight-hued cheek. And if that were true? He smiled, the expression full of a tenderness that threatened to undo her completely. Then I guess I've already started fixing it. Later that night, when the palace lights had dimmed to a nocturnal glow and the chaos of the assassination attempt had settled into a tense, watchful quiet, Lyra stood alone on her private balcony, staring out at the swirling colors of the nebula of lost voices. Her guards had been dismissed with a firmness that brooked no argument. Her crown lay discarded on a nearby plinth, its weight suddenly unbearable. All she could think about was the human who had stood before her, defying every law of rank and physics and reason, and somehow, in the process, making her feel more alive than she ever had. When she finally whispered his name into the star-dusted void, it wasn't a command. It was a surrender. Kalen. And somewhere in the Spartan quarters of the maintenance wing, sitting on the edge of his bunk and staring at a schematic he wasn't really seeing, Kalen Vorik smiled, a sudden, unaccountable warmth spreading through his chest. The royal court had barely begun its investigation into the assassination attempt when a new, more insidious crisis emerged. Kalen, operating on a direct, if informally delivered, order from Lyra herself, was running a deep-level diagnostic on the flagship Central Security mainframe. She told the council it was to prevent another breach. The truth, which they both understood, was that she wanted his clever, irreverent mind on the problem, and she wanted him close. He hadn't questioned it. But as he traced the corrupted data packet that had ghosted past the firewalls to trigger the bomb, the digital trail led him somewhere chillingly close, a backdoor woven directly into the palace's own internal security network. The traitor was inside. He didn't wait for protocol. He burst into the strategy chamber in the middle of a high-level briefing, his entrance cutting through a debate on border tariffs. Your Majesty, he said, his chest heaving from the run. You've got a viper in your nest. The room fell into a stunned silence. Lyra rose from her seat at the head of the obsidian table, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp. Explain. Now. Kalen slammed a data chip onto the table's surface. A holographic stream of crimson code erupted into the air. These command prompts, these aren't some fringe anarchist signature. They're internal. High-level clearance. Someone with access to your personal schedule and security codes authorized the remote detonation. A wave of horrified murmurs swept the room. One of her senior generals, a grizzled Zillion named Torv, stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. Human, you accuse the royal guard of treason? I'm not accusing anyone, Kalen shot back, his gaze never leaving Lyra. I'm showing you the proof. The encryption key, the access logs, it all points to one source. Lyra's face, already pale, lost another shade of color as her eyes scanned the damning data. The digital signature belonged to her most trusted advisor, Lord Malachar, a man who had served her father and had guided her own hand since her ascension. "Guards," she said, her voice trembling with a rage so cold it froze the air. "Seize him." Malachar didn't try to run. He simply stepped back from the table, a bitter, resigned smile twisting his features. "My Empress," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "You have lost your way. You let this human vermin crawl through our most sacred systems, whispering in your ear. You have weakened the Dominion. You have doomed us all." Kalen tensed as the old advisor's hand moved towards his ornate ceremonial sash. He wasn't reaching for a hidden weapon. He was aiming for a data slug, designed to wipe the entire central core if inserted. Lyra was too far away, too stunned by the betrayal to move. Cole didn't think. For the second time in as many days, he moved on pure instinct. He slammed into the Empress, not to tackle her, but to spin her behind him as he lunged across the table, his hand closing over Malachar's wrist a heartbeat before the data slug could connect with the table's interface. The struggle was brief and brutal. The Praetorians were on Malachar in seconds, wrenching him away, the data slug clattering harmlessly to the floor. But Kalen stayed where he was, half sprawled across the polished obsidian, breathing heavily, his body positioned as a shield between Lyra and the traitor. Lyra blinked up at him from where she'd stumbled against her throne, her mind reeling from the speed of it all. You did it again." He pushed himself up, grimacing as he put weight on his injured back, and gave her a faint, pained grin. "Guess I'm making a habit of it." Her heart was a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. He was standing over her, one hand braced on the table beside her, his uniform jacket still misbuttoned from his escape from the medbay, his eyes filled with that same impossible, unwavering defiance. "You should really stop saving me," she whispered, the words meant for him alone. "And deprive you of my charming heroics?" He teased softly, his voice a low rumble. "Not a chance." Their eyes locked. The world, with its traitors and its politics and its endless protocols, seemed to shrink, to fade into a distant hum. The shocked faces of her ministers, the subdued struggles of Malachar, the very ship around them. It all melted away, leaving nothing but the scant inches of air between them. "Kalen," she breathed, and it wasn't a protest. It was an acknowledgement. "Yeah, that fooled no one. You will stop calling me Sparkles in front of the entire Royal Council." He grinned, the expression lighting up his whole face. "In front of them? Sure." Her glare was pure theatrics, already softening at the edges. "And in private? Not a chance," he murmured, his voice dropping to an intimate timbre. Her lips parted. She wanted to say yes, to command him, to uphold the last shred of her dignity. But the warmth in his gaze, the sheer, solid reality of him, dissolved the word before it could form. "No," she admitted, the single syllable a surrender more profound than any treaty. His hand lifted slowly, carefully, as if approaching a rare and delicate artifact. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, a touch so gentle it was almost not there at all. "Careful your radiance," he whispered. "Then I won't." The chamber around them was a painting of frozen scandal. Nobles stared, aghast and enthralled. The Praetorians, now holding a silently seething Malachar, looked on in confusion. The Empress, who had never allowed a soul to touch her without permission, was leaning into the caress of a human engineer. "You are impossible," she murmured, the words a benediction. "Everyone keeps saying that," he said, his thumb stroking her cheek. "But you're the only one who says it like it's a good thing." Her heart was racing so fast she thought the biomonitors in the walls might trigger an alarm. "Kalen, what in the 7 stars am I going to do with you?" He smiled, a real, open, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "Maybe just keep me." That silenced her completely. For all the banter, for all the defiance and the teasing, that simple, profound truth cut through every defense she had left. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her face. The court watched, a collective breath held. The Empress straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting with its customary regal authority. But her voice, when she spoke, trembled with an emotion no one had ever heard from her before. "This man," she declared, her words clear and resonant in the silent room, "has twice now risked his life to preserve mine and the security of the Dominion. His insolence is legendary. His loyalty is beyond question." Kalen blinked, slowly realizing what was happening. "As of this moment," Lyra continued, her star-flecked eyes locked with his, "Kalen Vorik is to be granted the title of Royal Engineer, personal attaché to the throne, answerable to no authority but my own." The chamber erupted in a wave of shocked whispers and muttered protests. Kalen turned fully towards her, half in disbelief. "You're serious?" She met his gaze, a faint, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "Entirely. Consider it your punishment for repeatedly disobeying my direct orders to rest." He laughed, a quiet, joyful sound. "You've got a really strange way of punishing people." Lyra took a small step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Perhaps I enjoy keeping troublemakers where I can see them. Guess I'll have to try harder to behave then." "I would prefer you didn't," she said softly, her eyes sparkling. "You are far more interesting this way." The corners of his mouth lifted into a lopsided grin. "You know, you're kind of terrifying when you flirt." "I do not flirt," she started, then stopped herself. The smile that spread across her lips was unlike any royal expression she had ever worn. It was pure, unadulterated joy. "You are fortunate I am fond of you, human." He met her gaze, his own filled with a warmth that promised supernovas. "Then I'm the luckiest engineer in this galaxy, or any other." For a long, breathless moment, they simply looked at each other, around them forgotten, and then, in front of her entire council, the traitor, and the stunned Praetorian Guard, Kalen leaned down slowly, deliberately, and kissed her. It wasn't a long kiss, or a particularly passionate one by galactic standards. It was gentle. It was reverent. It was a promise. When he pulled back, Lyra's face was flushed a luminous, brilliant violet. "That," she whispered, her voice husky, "was extremely inappropriate." "Probably," he agreed, his smile unwavering. "Want me to apologize?" "No," she said, her voice barely a sound. His grin widened. "Then I won't." And for the first time, the rumor spread through the palace with a speed that defied physics, outpacing even the news of Lord Malaker's treason. The human kissed the Empress. Within an hour, it had been dissected, analyzed, and mythologized in every corridor and mess hall. Half the nobility declared it the highest form of treason. The other half whispered it was a romance written in the stars. And Lyra, Empress of the Seven Veiled Stars, sat through the ensuing emergency council meetings with an expression of serene, unshakable calm that fooled absolutely no one. Kalen, for his part, tried to return to some semblance of a normal routine. He tried and failed spectacularly. Everywhere he went, attendants stopped to stare, guards offered him awkward, confused salutes, and visiting dignitaries whispered behind their hands. He pretended not to notice, but the heat creeping up the back of his neck was a constant, telltale companion. By the end of the standard week cycle, he decided to hide out in the main engineering bay, the one place that smelled of ozone, lubricant, and honest work, a welcome refuge from the perfumed politics of the upper decks. He was elbow-deep in a plasma conduit regulator when the bay doors hissed open. "I was wondering where my royal engineer had escaped to." Kalen sighed, wiping his hands on a grimy rag before turning. "I didn't escape. I'm working. You know, that thing you keep pretending I don't actually do for a living." Lyra stepped inside, accompanied by only a single, stone-faced Praetorian who wisely took up a position just inside the door. She had foregone her formal regalia for a simpler gown of deep blue silk that seemed to drink the light, but her expression was softer now, more curious than commanding. "You have been avoiding the court?" she stated, her tail of shimmering hair flicking gently. "Avoiding? No," he countered, leaning against the console. "Strategically relocating." Your entire court stares at me like I reprogrammed the gravity to only work on Tuesdays. She tilted her head, a faint smile touching her lips. Perhaps because you did kiss their Empress in front of the entire ruling council. He rubbed the back of his neck, leaving a fresh smudge of grease. Yeah, about that. In my defense, it felt like the right moment to make a point. Lyra crossed her arms, the motion somehow both regal and playful. You have a particular talent for inciting political chaos with impeccably terrible timing. And you have a talent for not throwing me out the nearest airlock for it. Her smile deepened, crinkling the corners of her star-flecked eyes. You have learned how to negotiate with me. Experience, he said lightly, and a couple of near-death experiences, really focuses the mind. They moved deeper into the bay, where the steady, powerful hum of the ship's primary reactors created a private universe of sound, muffling their voices from even the most sensitive auditory sensors. For the first time since the strategy chamber, there were no watching eyes, no listening ears. No ministers, no guards, no gossipy. Just the Empress and the man who refused to bow. Lyra stopped beside a towering, glowing energy conduit, her small form silhouetted against its pulsing blue light. Kaelin, she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. When you kissed me, was that impulse or intention? He looked at her for a long moment, his playful demeanor settling into something more serious, more real. Both. Her brows knit together. Explain. He crouched down slightly, bringing them to eye level. Impulse, because I looked at you, standing there so fierce and so... you. And I couldn't stop myself. Intention, because I've wanted to do it for weeks, and I decided I wasn't going to wait for another bomb to go off to show you how I feel. Her heart gave a small, traitorous flutter. You are truly the most reckless man I have ever met. Yeah, he said, a faint, wry smile on his face. But I'm consistent. She hesitated, then looked down at her hands. The council, they will not approve. They will say you have compromised the throne, that I have compromised myself. He leaned a hip against the railing beside her, his shoulder nearly brushing the top of her head. Then maybe the throne needed compromising. Lyra blinked, startled by the sheer, simple audacity of the statement. You speak as though love were an act of rebellion. He shrugged, his gaze steady on her. Maybe it is. You've spent your entire life being obeyed, Lyra. Maybe it's time someone just chose you. The words landed with the force of a meteor strike. Chosen. Not because of her title, not out of duty or fear, but chosen for who she was. She turned to face him fully, her eyes glimmering in the conduit's glow. And what if that someone were, by every metric of my society, beneath her? A common engineer from a backwater world. Kaelin's grin returned, wide and unapologetic. Then I'd tell her she's short enough that we're practically eye level when I do this. Her laugh slipped out before she could stop it. A soft, melodic sound that was swallowed by the engine's hum. You are insufferable. Still not hearing a no, he pointed out, his voice dropping to a murmur. No, she said, and this time the word was filled with a warmth, a surrender, that left no room for misunderstanding. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing against the back of her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, letting her tiny fingers slide between his. For a moment, they simply stood there in the mechanical heart of the ship, human and Vesperan, monarch and mechanic, bound by something that transcended titles and territories, something both of them finally, fully understood. Lyra broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. You realize the political consequences of this will be significant. Yeah, he said, but I also realize something else. And what is that? He smiled, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. You look a lot happier when you're not pretending to be annoyed with me. She bit her lip, a flash of genuine, unguarded humor in her eyes. Then perhaps you should continue being impossible. He leaned closer, his voice a low, intimate tease. Careful, your radiance. You might make me think you actually like me. I already told you, she said, looking up at him with a smirk that was all Empress and all hers. You presume too much. And yet, he murmured, his face inches from hers. I'm always right. Lyra opened her mouth to deliver a scathing retort, but then she just sighed, a sound of pure, defeated amusement. You are impossible to command. That, he said, his smile softening into something profound, is what makes me perfect for you. She laughed, shaking her head in wonder, and turned toward the door. Report to my observatory tomorrow evening, Vorik. We have diplomatic optics to discuss. Sure, he said, the grin back in full force. Just promise you won't bite. No promises, she said over her shoulder, and disappeared through the doorway, the Praetorian falling into step behind her without a backward glance. Kalen exhaled slowly, a long, shuddering breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. He stared after her, at the space where she had been, and then softly, to the humming conduit beside him, said, Guess the smallest Empress in the galaxy just claimed the biggest idiot alive. And for the first time in his life, Kalen Vorik didn't mind the title one bit. Weeks turned into a standard cycle, and the galaxy, with its infinite capacity for gossip, slowly and uneasily adjusted to the new reality. The tiny, formidable Empress of the Vesperan Dominion was consistently, and very publicly, seen in the company of a human. Not as a bodyguard, not as a servant, but as a companion. The one who had defied her court, saved her life twice, uncovered a deep-rooted treason, and then kissed her in front of her most powerful subjects. Diplomatic channels buzzed with a mixture of disbelief, scorn, and a strange, burgeoning curiosity. Some called it a scandal, others a masterstroke of public relations. The Empress, when asked, offered a serene smile and changed the subject to trade tariffs. Kalen's new title, Royal Engineer and Attaché to the Throne, became the most whispered phrase from one end of the seven systems to the other. He wore it like he wore his old maintenance coveralls, without ceremony, with his sleeves often rolled up and a familiar, infuriating smirk never far from his lips. If any of the newly curious diplomats managed to corner him and ask what it was like to serve the most powerful woman in the sector, he'd just shrug and say, mostly it involves fixing things that were never broken in the first place. Apparently, it's a growth industry. But beneath the jokes and the easy deflection, he knew the truth of it. And so did she. One quiet night, he was summoned not to fix a malfunction, but to join her on the ship's primary observation deck. The vast chamber was empty, its domed ceiling a perfect, transparent portal to the star-strewn blackness outside. She was there, a small, solitary figure swamped by a large, floating chair, her bare feet tucked up beneath her. She wore a simple, unadorned dress the color of deep space, and she was staring out at the swirling eddies of a nearby nebula. When she heard the door sigh open, she didn't turn. You're late, Vorik. He smiled as he walked across the deck, his boots silent on the soft flooring. You keep saying that, but I'm starting to think you just like the sound of your own voice giving me orders. Perhaps I do, she said, a smile in her voice. He came to stand beside her chair, leaning on the railing that separated them from the infinite void. For a long time they didn't speak. They just watched the silent, majestic ballet of cosmic dust and nascent stars, the nebula painting the observation deck in soft hues of violet and gold. Then Lyra said, her voice soft and thoughtful, When I was a child, my tutors taught me that humans were a blunt, emotional species, prone to sentimentality and illogical attachments. He chuckled. They weren't wrong about the attachments. No, she agreed, a faint smile gracing her lips, but they never told me that such attachments could feel like coming home. Kalen looked at her then, really looked, at the proud, delicate line of her profile, the subtle luminescence of her skin in the nebula's light, the impossible combination of supreme authority and vulnerable wonder. And you, he said, his own voice soft, were supposed to be this untouchable, distant monarch, a figurehead of cold power, her head tilted up toward him. And am I not? He grinned. Not even close. You're about as terrifying as a supernova wrapped in a blanket. Her laugh echoed softly in the vast, glass-domed space, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. You should be careful, Kalen Vorik. I could still have you reassigned to asteroid duty for insubordination. Yeah, he said easily. But then who'd adjust your crown when it gets crooked during your speeches? She looked up at him, her expression pretending to be stern, but the glowing warmth in her eyes giving her away completely. You're insufferable. I know. And impossible. Also true. And, she added, her voice dropping to a whisper that was almost lost in the silence. Mine. That stopped him. He blinked, then a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. Was that an official imperial decree? Consider it one, she said, her own smile trembling at the edges. He knelt down then, properly, so they were perfectly face to face, her gaze level with his. Then I guess I should say it back. She blinked, suddenly looking unsure, vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. Say what? That I'm yours, he said, his voice low and sure. And that you're mine. For the Empress who commanded fleets and shaped the destinies of worlds, it was staggering how her heart could feel so full, so complete, from something so simple, so fundamentally human. You are aware, she murmured, her star-flecked eyes shimmering, that such declarations hold no legal weight in Vesperan law. He smiled, a gentle, loving curve of his lips. Good thing I wasn't talking about law. Her lips curved into a trembling, radiant smile. You should kiss me again, before I find a reason to make this particular brand of insubordination illegal. He didn't need a second invitation. The kiss was softer than the first, deeper than the second. There was no scandal, no audience, just the two of them, adrift in the endless, silent sea of stars. Her small hands came up to frame his face, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her effortlessly from the chair to hold her close. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, her breathing slightly unsteady. Kalen, she whispered, you make me forget I was ever supposed to be alone. Good, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. You were never meant to be alone, Lyra. Or untouched, just unreachable. Until now. She closed her eyes, letting the profound quiet of the cosmos and the steady, solid beat of his heart fill the silence between them. Do you think, she asked softly, the galaxy will ever understand this? Understand us? He smiled, nuzzling gently against her temple. Probably not, but I bet they'll talk about it for centuries. Her laugh was a soft puff of air against his neck. That, I can live with. He looked out at the nebula again, then back down at her, nestled securely in his arms. You know, he said thoughtfully, for someone 3 feet tall, you take up a ridiculous amount of space in my head. Then perhaps, she said, curling contentedly against his chest, it is time your head learned a thing or two about interstellar diplomacy. He chuckled, the sound a warm rumble she could feel through his jacket. I'll consider it, but no promises. She smiled, a true, peaceful, happy smile. You are impossible. Still your favorite, though. Unfortunately, she whispered, pressing a kiss to the base of his throat. Yes. They sat in silence after that, watching the nebula slowly turn, her tiny hand tucked securely in his, her head resting over his heart. Outside, the universe continued its ancient, indifferent expansion. But inside that glass dome, 2 hearts, one human, one Vesperan, beat in a perfect, defiant, and harmonious rhythm. And somewhere deep within the archival core of the Starlight Scepter, a new chronicle was quietly begun. It told the story of how, among all her political conquests and strategic triumphs, the smallest empress of the 7 veiled stars was ultimately, and joyfully, conquered by a human who came to fix her shields and, in doing so, irrevocably mended her heart. The official announcement, when it came, was not met with universal applause. The chamber of the High Synod was a tempest of swirling robes and raised, indignant voices. A human, Chancellor Grav, a Zillion whose skin was a particularly murky shade of blue, thundered, his voice modulator straining. To be not just your consort, but given a formal seat on the royal council? It is an abomination, a stain upon the Vesperan lineage. Empress Lyra sat upon her floating throne, her expression one of carved amethyst. She did not flinch, did not raise her voice. She simply let the wave of outrage crash against her silence. Kalen, standing at her right side, a position that had caused its own minor scandal, shifted his weight slightly. He was in a formal version of his engineer's uniform, the only concession to royalty being a thin silver band around his brow that matched the one in Lyra's hair. He felt like an exhibit in a zoo, but he kept his face neutral, his gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. The human has no noble blood, a Thician matriarch hissed, her frills flaring. He has no understanding of our ways, our history. Lyra finally moved, raising one delicate hand. The chamber fell silent, not out of respect, but out of anticipation for the coming rebuttal. He has, she said, her voice clear and cutting through the tension like a laser, saved your Empress from assassination. Twice, he has uncovered a traitor embedded in our highest court. His ways have proven more effective at preserving this dominion than centuries of your cherished protocols. She let her gaze sweep over them. My decision is not a subject for debate. It is a decree. The silence that followed was heavier, more dangerous than the shouting. Kalen could feel the hostility like a physical pressure. Later, in the sanctity of her private gardens, a biosphere filled with floating, phosphorescent flora from her homeworld, Lyra let out a breath, the regal mask dissolving into weary frustration. They will never accept you, she murmured, watching a glowing spore duster float past. Kalen came up behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. I don't need them to accept me, Sparkles. I just need them to not actively try to kill you. Or me. Preferably me, actually. She leaned back into his touch. Do not joke. Their methods will be subtle. Political maneuvering, economic pressure, whispers in the dark. It is a battle you are not trained for. Good thing I'm a quick learner, he said, kneading the tension from her shoulders. And I've got the best teacher in the galaxy. She turned in his arms, her star-flecked eyes searching his. I have dragged you into a world of vipers, Kalen. I fear what I have asked you to endure. He smiled, that infuriating, wonderful, grounding smile. You didn't drag me. I jumped, and I'd do it again. Besides, he added, his tone lightening, vipers are just animals with a bad reputation and faulty wiring. Everything can be understood, and most things can be fixed. The first test came sooner than expected. A week later, a gift arrived from a fringe system known for its opposition to Lyra's policies. It was a magnificent, ancient Vesperan light sculpture, a complex lattice of crystal that was meant to respond to the unique biosignature of the royal bloodline, glowing with specific patterns. It was a test of Kalen's legitimacy. The entire court watched as the crate was opened. Lyra approached, placed her hand on the central node. The sculpture remained dark and inert. A wave of smug satisfaction rippled through the watching nobles. It was a public, undeniable rejection. Lyra's face was a mask of cold fury. But before she could speak, Kalen stepped forward. May I? He asked, his voice casual. Skeptical, she nodded. He didn't place his hand on it. Instead, he pulled a multi-tool from his belt, ignoring the scandalized gasps, and began to gently tap the crystal lattice, listening intently. He traced the internal pathways with a microscanner. As I thought, he muttered. The biolock is a secondary system. The primary motivator is a standard photic resonance cell, and it's been deliberately misaligned. Probably during its restoration, he made a minute adjustment with a sonic driver deep within the base. There was a soft chime. Then, the entire sculpture erupted not in the traditional serene blue of the Vesperan line, but in a riotous, joyful explosion of every color in the spectrum, swirling and dancing in patterns that had never been seen before. It was vibrant, unpredictable, and utterly beautifully human. The court was struck dumb. Lyra stared at the dazzling display, then at Kalen, who simply shrugged. The manual override works fine. Guess it just needed a different perspective. The political victory was small, but significant. He hadn't tried to mimic their ways. He had improved upon them with his own. The Vipers, for a time, retreated. But the quiet moments were their true victory. Kaelin taught her poker, and she, with her preternatural ability to read micro-expressions, nearly bankrupted him of his meager credits. She, in turn, tried to teach him the Vespern art of stellar navigation through meditative thought, which mostly ended with him falling asleep and her laughing at his snores. He installed a real coffee maker in her private kitchen, and the smell of it became as much a part of her morning as the reports from the frontier. One evening, he found her staring at a star chart, a deep frown on her face. A mining colony in a remote system was suffering from a mysterious plague, and medical supplies were stalled by bureaucratic red tape. The council argues jurisdiction. They debate while my people suffer, she said, her voice thick with a helpless anger he had never heard in her before. Kaelin studied the chart for a moment, then pointed to a faint, almost forgotten hyperlane route. That's an old smuggler's run, unpatrolled. The Starlight Scepter is too big, but a fast courier. I could take one. I've run that route before, back when I was on the freighters. She stared at him. You would go? Into an unsecured system, for people you have never met. They're your people, he said simply. That makes them mine. He went. Took him 3 days. He bypassed the blockades, navigated the treacherous asteroid fields, and delivered the supplies himself, personally overseeing their distribution. When he returned, grimy and exhausted, he was met not by the full court, but by Lyra alone in the hangar bay. She didn't say a word. She just walked up to him, pressed her forehead against his chest, and held onto the front of his jacket for a long, long time. The news of the successful, unsanctioned mission spread. The story of the human consort who risked his life for a handful of miners in a forgotten system did more to win over the common citizens of the Dominion than 1,000 royal decrees ever could. He was no longer just the Empress's reckless human. He was becoming their champion. On the anniversary of the day he had first called her Sparkles, Lyra summoned him to the observation deck. The nebula was particularly brilliant that night. She was waiting for him, and in her hands was not a data slate or a piece of royal jewelry, but a simple, carefully wrapped package. For you, she said, her voice unusually shy. He unwrapped it. Inside was a tool, but it was like no tool he had ever seen. The handle was forged from a dark, iridescent Vespern metal, warm to the touch. The business end was a perfectly calibrated, multifunctional engineering interface, capable of syncing with both human and Vespern systems. It was a masterpiece. They said it is unorthodox, a blend of our technology and yours. I told them that was the point. Kaelin turned it over in his hands, feeling its perfect balance, its potential. It was a symbol of their union, more powerful than any crown. Lyra, he breathed. I don't know what to say. You do not have to say anything, she whispered, stepping closer. You fixed a shield, Kaelin Vorik. But you built a bridge. You built us. He pulled her into his arms, the new tool still clutched in his hand, and kissed her under the witness of 1 billion stars. The galaxy was vast and filled with unknown dangers, and the politics of her court were a perpetual storm. But in that moment, holding his Empress, his love, his sparkles, Kaelin knew that some things, once mended, were stronger than they had ever been before. And somewhere in the archives, the chronicle was updated once more, noting that the smallest Empress and her human had not just changed each other. They were, together, quietly and defiantly, changing everything. If you love stories where humans change the galaxy with heart instead of power, don't forget to subscribe for more HFY sci-fi tales.